When Care Decides, Care, Control, and the Case of Jane Toppan. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Author's note. Some dialogue, interior reflection, and patient reconstructions have been imaginatively rendered to reflect documented patterns rather than verbatim records. Where certainty ends, context and probability guide interpretation. The aim is understanding, not sensationalism. Preface. The woman history remembers as Jane Toppan was not born with that name, nor with the identity later pressed upon her. She began life as Honora Kelly, a child of mid-19th century Boston, shaped by poverty, illness, and disappearance. By the time she entered the public record, she had already learned one of the central lessons of her age, that some lives were watched, and others were not. This book is not written to shock. It is written because the story of Jane Toppan has too often been flattened into a single grotesque idea: the mad nurse, the female monster, the aberration. That version of her life is convenient. It allows institutions to absolve themselves, and it allows society to believe that what happened was rare, inexplicable, and safely contained in one damaged individual. The truth is more troubling. Jane Toppan did not kill in alleyways or parlors. She killed in beds. She killed while performing care. She killed people who were already expected to die: the poor, the sick, the elderly, the socially marginal. She operated within hospitals and private sick rooms at a time when nursing was trusted implicitly, records were lax, drugs were abundant, and death among the poor attracted little scrutiny. Her crimes were not spectacular. They were quiet, clinical, and easily absorbed into the ordinary background noise of 19th century mortality. This book takes the position that Jane Toppan cannot be understood without understanding the systems that made her possible. Victorian and Edwardian medicine sat at a dangerous crossroads, advanced enough to prolong life, but not advanced enough to monitor those who controlled it. Nurses were given extraordinary power with minimal oversight. Women were assumed to be naturally nurturing. Poor patients were assumed to be fragile, unreliable witnesses to their own suffering. When they died, it was rarely a surprise. Jane learned all of this long before she ever administered a lethal dose. Her childhood was marked by instability, abandonment, and erasure. Her education taught obedience rather than empathy. Her nursing career gave her authority without accountability. Her psychological world was shaped by control rather than attachment. When she later spoke of her crimes, her words were filtered through male doctors eager to reduce her actions to sexual deviance or madness, because those explanations were easier than confronting institutional failure. This book does not excuse her, nor does it sensationalize her. It treats her as a human being whose choices caused irrevocable harm, and as a product of a society that did not notice the harm until it touched the wrong people. Where records are incomplete, this work is transparent about uncertainty. Where interpretations are offered, they are grounded in historical context, psychological research, and contemporary accounts. Victims are not treated as footnotes. They are named where possible, and acknowledged where they are not. Their invisibility is part of the story. Australian English is used deliberately. Distance sharpens perspective. This is not a book about American pathology alone, but about Western medical culture more broadly, one that crossed oceans, empires, and institutions. The same assumptions about care, class, and gender traveled easily, and their consequences were not confined to one country. Jane Toppan was not inevitable. But once certain conditions were in place, she was possible. This book asks a simple, unsettling question. If a nurse killed the poor for years, in full view of the medical system, why would anyone have noticed? The pages that follow are an attempt to answer that. Chapter 1. A Child Without Continuity. Boston, 1854 to 1860. There are children whose lives begin with a story, and others whose lives begin with a condition. Honora Kelly belonged to the second kind. She did not arrive into the world trailing expectation or promise. She arrived into circumstance, narrow, airless, already closing. She was born in 1854 in Boston's North End, a place that smelled of damp wool, boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and sickness. The streets were crowded and loud, but the rooms above them were quieter in a dangerous way, holding the kind of silences that came from exhaustion rather than peace. Families lived stacked atop one another, whole lives compressed into a handful of rooms. Privacy was a luxury. Cleanliness was conditional. Illness moved freely. Honora's mother, Bridget Kelly, was already unwell when the child was born. Tuberculosis was not yet called tuberculosis in the way it would later be. It was consumption, a wasting disease that moved slowly and with a kind of terrible politeness. People spoke of it in lowered voices, as if naming it too loudly might summon it faster. In the North End, it was common enough to be expected, but not common enough to be accepted. Bridget coughed through Honora's infancy. The sound threaded through the flat day and night, dry at first, then wet, then hollow. It became the background to the child's earliest memories, though memory itself would later prove unreliable. What Honora absorbed instead was pattern, the way adults spoke around illness, the way bodies failed gradually rather than all at once, the way no single moment marked the beginning or the end. Her father, Peter Kelly, worked when he could as a tailor. When he could not, he drank. Alcohol was cheaper than medicine and more readily available than hope. He was not cruel in the theatrical sense. There were no famous beatings, no legendary rages passed down in neighborhood whispers. He was worse than that. He was inconsistent. Some days he was present, even gentle, telling stories in a soft voice that smelled faintly of spirits and sweat. Other days he was absent without explanation, gone from morning until well into the night, returning hollow-eyed and irritable, as if life itself had offended him. Honora learned early that attention could not be relied upon. It appeared without warning and disappeared just as easily. She did not cry much. There was little point. Crying did not bring comfort. It brought annoyance, or worse, a strained sort of guilt in adults already stretched thin. Instead, she watched. Watching was safer. By the time she was 3, illness had become ordinary. Neighbors died. Children disappeared from the stairwells and were not spoken of again. Black crepe appeared on doors. Honora absorbed death the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes, not as a concept, but as a rhythm. Her mother grew thinner. Her skin took on a waxy pallor, stretched too tightly over bone. Bridget would sit by the window in the afternoons, coughing into a handkerchief already stained brown-red, watching the street below as if trying to memorize it before it was taken away. Sometimes Honora sat beside her. Sometimes she was forgotten in another room entirely. When Bridget died, there was no moment of drama. No final speech. No gathering of loved ones. She simply stopped one afternoon, breath trailing off into nothing. The room held its shape. The noise outside continued. Someone fetched a neighbor. Someone fetched a priest. Honora was moved aside like furniture. She did not scream. She did not cling to the body. She did not understand that this was a line that could not be crossed back over. What she understood was that her mother had been sick, and now she was still. Stillness made sense. What did not make sense was what followed. Her father did not mourn in any recognizable way. He drank more. He spoke less. Sometimes he stared at Honora as if she were evidence of something he had failed to prevent. Sometimes he did not look at her at all. The household frayed. Meals became erratic. The flat grew dirtier, not because anyone chose neglect, but because effort itself became a burden. People came and went. A neighbor might watch Honora for an afternoon, then not again. An aunt appeared briefly, spoke in harsh whispers, and left. Nothing settled. Children need continuity in order to understand cause and effect. Honora had none. Events happened, then stopped happening. People appeared, then vanished. There were no explanations offered, and she did not ask for them. Questions required answers, and answers required attention. At some point, there is no record of the exact day, her father stopped coming home. He did not announce his departure. There was no packed bag, no farewell. He simply did not return one evening, and then not the next, and then not the next. His absence grew heavier with each passing hour, until it was more present than he had ever been. Honora waited. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of the bed, feet not yet touching the floor, listening for footsteps that never came. She learned something essential in those days. Waiting was an action that did not change outcomes. Eventually, someone noticed she was alone. The intervention was administrative rather than compassionate. A child without parents was not a tragedy so much as a problem to be solved. She was passed along quietly, her existence noted in ledgers rather than conversations. There were no keepsakes gathered, no rituals to mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. Her old name went with her, but only briefly. She was sent to Lowell, Massachusetts, to live with the Toppan family. The arrangement was not adoption in the modern sense. It was placement. Charity with conditions. The Toppans were respectable, orderly, and emotionally restrained. They offered shelter, food, schooling, and discipline. What they did not offer was belonging. Honora became Jane. The name change was not ceremonial. It was practical. Jane was easier. Jane sounded proper. Jane fitted more neatly into ledgers and introductions. Honora, Irish, Catholic, poor, carried too much history. The child accepted the change without protest. Names, she had already learned, were temporary. In the Toppan household, she occupied a space somewhere between servant and dependent. She was not beaten. She was not starved. She was not loved. Affection was rationed carefully, reserved for biological children whose futures mattered in a way hers did not. Jane learned how to move quietly through rooms, how to complete tasks efficiently, how to observe moods and adjust her behavior accordingly. She learned that approval was transactional, obedience rewarded, deviation punished by withdrawal rather than violence. The house was clean, predictable, emotionally sparse. For the first time in her life, there were rules that stayed the same from one day to the next. This should have been comforting. Instead, it taught her something colder. Stability did not equal safety. Stability simply meant the terms of survival were fixed. She began to excel at invisibility. At school, she was unremarkable. Intelligent enough to keep pace, quiet enough to avoid notice. Teachers described her as well-behaved, reserved, diligent. None of them remarked on warmth. None of them remarked on cruelty. She was neither. She was adaptive. Illness continued to thread through her life. The Toppans were not immune to sickness, and when it arrived, Jane watched closely. She watched the way adults behaved differently around the ill. Voices softened. Rules bent. Authority shifted subtly towards whoever controlled comfort. She noticed how pain reorganized households. How the sick were centered, even temporarily. How suffering created importance. She did not yet connect these observations to desire. But the information lodged itself somewhere permanent. By adolescence, Jane had developed an internal economy that functioned without reliance on others. She did not expect affection, so she did not miss it. She did not expect permanence, so she did not fear loss. What she valued instead was comprehension. Knowing how things worked. Knowing what people needed. Knowing what made situations change. Death did not frighten her. It had never been violent in her experience. It had been gradual, ordinary, absorbed into the architecture of daily life. People faded. Rooms emptied. Others took their place. What frightened her, though she would not have named it as fear, was irrelevance. In the Toppan household, she was useful. That was her security. Usefulness could be maintained. Affection could not. When she was old enough to consider a future, it did not present itself as aspiration. It presented itself as function. She needed a role that allowed her to remain necessary, to remain present, to remain in control of her own continuity. Nursing, when it appeared, did not look like a calling. It looked like a solution. Hospitals needed women who could endure unpleasantness without complaint. Women who could obey instructions precisely. Women who could move among sickness and death without collapsing. Jane already possessed these qualities. They had been shaped into her long before she knew they were valued. By the time she left the Toppan household to begin her training, she carried very little with her. No letters. No keepsakes. No family stories worth preserving. What she carried instead was a set of internal rules. People disappear. Attention is conditional. Power belongs to those who control comfort. Death is ordinary. And nothing lasts unless you make it. She did not yet intend to kill anyone. But she had already learned where death lived. Chapter 2. The Father Who Vanished. Lowell and Boston, early 1860s. The story Jane would later tell, the one repeated in reports, interviews, and courtrooms, flattened her childhood into a simple sequence: mother dead, father gone, child taken in. It was neat. It suggested inevitability. It made sense to people who preferred lives to be reducible. What it left out was the waiting. Her father did not vanish all at once. He thinned first. His presence lost weight, like a body starved of nourishment. He began by coming home later than usual, then not at all on certain nights. When he did return, he seemed diminished, his voice softer, his eyes unfocused, as if he had stepped slightly out of alignment with the world. He spoke less to Jane, not out of cruelty but because conversation required energy he no longer possessed. There were mornings when Jane woke alone in the flat, the air stale and unmoving, the previous night's silence still pooled in the corners. She learned how to dress herself properly, how to eat whatever had been left behind, how to wait without expectation. These were not lessons delivered through instruction, they were acquired through repetition. At first, she assumed his absences were temporary. Adults disappeared and returned all the time. That was how the world worked. But as days stretched into weeks, something else settled in. Not fear. Not grief. A kind of recalibration. Children who are loved learn to anticipate care. Jane learned to anticipate absence. No one explained where her father had gone. No one sat her down to mark the change. The adult world moved on without ceremony, and she was expected to follow. She watched neighbors avoid the subject, their eyes skimming past her when she asked after him. She watched the way concern gave way to discomfort, then to indifference. This was her first sustained lesson in social disappearance. Eventually, practical matters intruded. Rent was owed. Food was scarce. A child alone in a tenement did not remain invisible for long. Someone, a neighbor, a parish worker, a distant relation, reported the situation. The response was efficient, not kind. Jane was collected. She remembered the sensation of being moved more clearly than the people who moved her. Hands on her shoulders, firm but not rough. The smell of soap. The clatter of stairs. Her feet dangling above the street as she was lifted into a cart. No one asked what she wanted. No one asked what she knew. Her father's name was written down somewhere, likely misspelt. His occupation noted. His status marked as unknown. The bureaucracy of care did not require certainty, only categories. In Lowell, the Toppan household was the opposite of the North End flat in almost every measurable way. The rooms were cleaner. The furniture was sturdier. The routines were fixed. There was a clock that governed the day and a sense that time itself behaved properly here, moving forward in a predictable line. Jane was grateful. She did not mistake this gratitude for love. The Toppans were not unkind, but kindness was not their priority. Order was. Respectability. The careful maintenance of appearances. Jane fitted into the household the way an extra chair might, useful when needed, unobtrusive when not. The name change came quickly. Honora was Irish Catholic, associated with poverty and unrest. Jane was neutral. Jane could belong anywhere. The decision was framed as practical, not personal. Jane accepted it without resistance. Names, she had already learned, were provisional. What she did not accept, what she noted and stored away, was how easily her identity could be altered by others. How little resistance the world offered when a child was renamed, repositioned, repurposed. In the Toppan household, affection followed bloodlines. Jane was fed, clothed, schooled. She was also reminded, subtly but consistently, that she was not quite the same as the other children. She was expected to be more grateful, more compliant, more restrained. Expectations were heavier when affection was lighter. She became excellent at reading rooms. She could tell, from the way a door was closed or a chair was pulled out, whether she would be noticed or ignored. She learned to perform usefulness before it was requested, to anticipate needs, to reduce her own footprint. This was not martyrdom. It was strategy. When she thought of her father, which was less often than one might expect, she did not feel anger. Anger required a sense of being wronged. Jane felt instead a mild, persistent curiosity. How does a person leave a child behind? How does that decision settle in the body? Does it ache, or does it fade? She never received an answer. The question remained open, unresolved, and that unresolved state would become familiar to her. At school, she was diligent. Teachers praised her discipline. They described her as serious, contained, reliable. They did not describe warmth. They did not describe imagination. Jane did not offer those things. She offered results. She watched other children receive affection without having to earn it, and noted the difference without resentment. Some people were protected by default. Others were protected by utility. She understood which category she occupied. Illness passed through the Toppan household like a visitor, unwelcome but manageable. A child with a fever. An adult laid up for days at a time. When this happened, Jane's role shifted. She fetched water, held cloths, ran errands. Her presence was tolerated, sometimes welcomed. She learned that sickness rearranged hierarchies. The ill were briefly important. Those who tended them gained access. She did not yet connect this to power. But she noticed how voices softened around the sick. How rules bent. How proximity increased. Care, she observed, created intimacy without requiring affection. When the sick recovered, the household returned to its usual shape. Jane receded again. The lesson was subtle but persistent. Attention was situational. As she grew older, her memories of her original home dimmed. The north end became abstract, smells without context, sounds without faces. Her mother's face blurred first, then her voice. Her father remained a silhouette, defined more by absence than presence. This did not distress her. Memory loss felt like adaptation. The past was not a place she needed to revisit. What stayed sharp was the sensation of being left. Not abandoned in a dramatic sense. Abandonment implied intention. What Jane experienced was something colder, disposability. She learned that people did not have to mean harm in order to cause it. They simply had to prioritize something else. By adolescence, she had internalized a private set of truths. Care could be withdrawn without warning. People disappeared without explanation. Identity was flexible, even optional. Security came from being needed, not loved. These truths did not make her cruel. They made her careful. When she later encountered institutions, schools, hospitals, training programs, she recognized them immediately for what they were: systems that valued function over feeling. Systems that rewarded obedience, endurance, and silence. She was well suited to them. The child who had waited alone in a tenement flat did not vanish. She simply learned how to ensure that, next time, she would not be the one left behind. Not if she could help it. Chapter 3. The House of Replacement. Lowell, Massachusetts, mid-1860s to early 1870s. The Toppan house did not feel like rescue. It felt like correction. It stood on a quieter street than any Jane had known before, the kind where noise was considered a failure of manners rather than a fact of life. The walls were solid, the floors scrubbed, the windows washed often enough that light entered without resistance. Everything had a place, and everything was expected to return to it. Disorder was not punished harshly, but it was noticed, and noticing, Jane would come to understand, was the precondition for control. Her place in the house was never explicitly defined, which made it more rigid than if it had been. She was not quite a servant, but neither was she a daughter. She occupied an intermediate category that required constant adjustment. She slept indoors, ate at the table, attended school. She also worked. She fetched, cleaned, watched, assisted. Gratitude was assumed, not discussed. The household ran on routine. Breakfast at the same hour. Chores completed in the same order. Even conversation followed patterns, looping around acceptable topics and avoiding anything that might unsettle the surface calm. Jane learned these patterns quickly. She had always been good at that. What she did not learn was how to belong. Belonging would have required indulgence, a softness that allowed mistakes, an allowance for emotional excess. The Toppans did not believe in excess of any kind. They believed in moderation, self-control, and reputation. Jane absorbed these values not because she admired them, but because they were enforced consistently. Affection was sparse and precise. Praise was delivered sparingly, and only in response to visible effort. Jane learned that approval was something to be earned through compliance, not something given freely. She did not resent this. Resentment required the expectation of something better. Her biological origins were not spoken of. The past was treated as a closed chapter, not to be reopened. This suited the household and increasingly, it suited Jane. The North End, her mother, her father, They belonged to another version of herself that no longer existed in any useful way. If Honora Kelly had been erased, Jane Toppan was the replacement. The name settled into her quickly. It was easier to pronounce, easier to spell, easier to explain. She noticed how adults responded differently when it was spoken, less hesitation, fewer assumptions. Jane was a name that moved through the world without friction. She took this in without comment. At school, she was unremarkable in the way that pleased teachers. She sat still. She followed instructions. She completed tasks accurately and without fuss. She did not seek attention, and she did not provoke it. Teachers described her as steady, serious, reliable. None of them described her as warm or imaginative. Those qualities were not required. She watched other girls carefully. She observed the ones who received indulgence, the daughters whose mistakes were corrected gently, whose moods were tolerated, whose futures were discussed openly. She noted the difference between girls who were protected and girls who were prepared. Jane was being prepared. She learned domestic skills thoroughly. Cleaning was done properly or not at all. Cooking followed recipes exactly. There was no room for improvisation. These were not merely chores, they were rehearsals for usefulness. The message was clear: value came from competence. When she made mistakes, they were corrected efficiently. Not with cruelty, but with disappointment, a subtler, more enduring form of discipline. Jane learned to avoid that look. She learned to anticipate expectations before they were voiced. This ability, to predict what was required and deliver it before being asked, became her primary mode of survival. The Toppans were not emotionally demonstrative people, but they were observant. They noticed Jane's reliability. They trusted her with responsibility. Trust was not affection, but it brought proximity. Jane understood the distinction instinctively. Illness provided her first glimpse of how proximity could deepen. When one of the household children fell ill with a fever, Jane was brought closer into the family's inner workings. She fetched water, prepared cloths, ran messages. She watched the way adults gathered around the sickbed, their usual reserve softened by concern. She saw how illness restructured attention, how it elevated the unwell to a position of temporary importance. She was not frightened by sickness. She had never been. She was attentive. She noticed how medication was administered without much ceremony. How dosages were estimated rather than measured. How authority shifted subtly to whoever controlled relief. The one who brought comfort held a quiet kind of power. This observation lodged itself deep, though it remained unexamined. As she entered adolescence, Jane became increasingly self-contained. She did not confide in others. She did not seek emotional closeness. She did not rebel. Rebellion was a luxury afforded to those who were already secure. Instead, she refined herself. She learned how to smile at the appropriate moments, how to suppress irritation, how to present calm even when unsettled. Emotional regulation became a skill she practiced deliberately. The less she revealed, the safer she felt. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when something like envy flickered. Watching a Toppan child cry openly and be comforted. Hearing a future discussed as something guaranteed rather than contingent. But these moments passed quickly. Envy required investment, and Jane had learned early not to invest in what she could not control. Her sense of self became functional rather than emotional. She defined herself by what she could do, not by how she felt. Feelings were unpredictable. Skills were reliable. As she grew older, conversations around her began to shift. The question of her future arose, not as an exploration of desire, but as a logistical matter. What would be done with her once she reached adulthood? She would not inherit. She would not remain indefinitely. She needed a role. Teaching was mentioned briefly, then dismissed. Domestic service was considered but deemed insufficiently respectable. Nursing, when it was raised, lingered. Nursing offered structure, training, purpose. It required endurance, discipline, obedience, all qualities Jane had in abundance. It promised proximity to authority without requiring authority itself. It offered usefulness without demanding emotional investment. Most importantly, it offered permanence of role. Hospitals always needed nurses. Illness was constant. Death was inevitable. Jane listened without revealing interest. She had learned that desire, expressed too openly, could be withdrawn as easily as it was offered. Instead, she waited. When the decision was made, it was framed as opportunity. A chance for her to make something of herself. A respectable path forward. Jane accepted it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. She did not yet understand how perfectly nursing would align with her internal logic. She did not yet articulate the connection between care and control, between attention and power. But she recognized, even then, that this was a role in which she could remain necessary. As she prepared to leave the Toppan household, there was no dramatic farewell. No expressions of loss. No assurances of return. She packed lightly. She had never accumulated much worth keeping. What she took with her was not memory, but method. She had learned how to replace herself. How to adapt. How to step into roles without leaving traces behind. She had learned that continuity was not given, it was constructed. And she had learned that the safest way to remain was to make oneself indispensable. The house of replacement had done its work. Jane Toppan was ready to enter the world. Chapter 4. Watching Without Being Seen. Lowell and Boston, early to mid-1870s. Adolescence did not arrive for Jane with drama. There was no moment of rebellion, no sharp turn away from authority, no hunger for excess. It settled over her quietly, like everything else had, altering the shape of her days without announcing itself. Her body changed. Her position in the household did not. She grew taller, leaner, more self-contained. She learned to move through rooms with an ease that came from practice rather than confidence. She knew where not to stand, when not to speak, how to withdraw just enough to avoid scrutiny without inviting suspicion. Invisibility, she had discovered, was not the absence of presence but the careful management of it. At school, expectations increased. Girls were prepared for futures that assumed marriage, children, and domesticity. Jane listened politely to these conversations without attaching herself to them. Marriage required emotional risk. Children required permanence. Both assumed a kind of belonging Jane did not trust. She did not imagine herself as anyone's center. Instead, she watched. She watched the girls who pushed against their boundaries and were gently pulled back. She watched the girls who cried and were comforted, and those whose tears were treated as inconvenience. She watched teachers soften around certain pupils and harden around others. Patterns revealed themselves quickly once you stopped hoping they might change. Jane learned that rules were not applied evenly. They bent for some and stiffened for others. This was not injustice in her mind, it was information. She paid close attention to illness during these years. The Toppan household, like all households, was not immune to it. Fevers passed through in winter. Coughs lingered. Once, an elderly relative stayed for several weeks, frail and short of breath, her presence quietly reorganizing the house. Jane found herself drawn closer to these moments. Not emotionally, she did not sit and weep at bedsides, but observationally. Illness altered behaviour. Voices softened. Authority shifted. The sick became temporarily central, their needs dictating the rhythms of the day. Jane noticed how adults deferred to whoever seemed most competent in managing the sickroom. Competence, she saw, generated trust more reliably than affection ever had. She was often asked to assist. Fetch water. Change cloths. Sit quietly while others rested. She complied without hesitation. She did not mind the proximity to illness. She had grown up with it. She did not associate it with fear. She associated it with attention. These observations did not yet form a desire. They formed a framework. As her schooling progressed, Jane's teachers praised her restraint. She was not easily distracted. She did not gossip. She did not daydream openly. She worked steadily, without flourish. When asked about her ambitions, she answered carefully, choosing responses that did not invite further inquiry. She had learned that curiosity directed at her could be dangerous. Attention, if prolonged, led to expectations. Expectations led to disappointment. Disappointment led to withdrawal. Better to remain useful and unremarkable. Emotionally, she was flattened, not numb, but contained. Feelings were experienced privately, briefly, and then set aside. She did not lack empathy in the abstract. She understood suffering intellectually. She simply did not feel compelled to mirror it outwardly. This would later be misread as coldness. At the time, it was survival. Jane's sense of identity during these years was thin, almost translucent. She defined herself by function rather than by inner narrative. She was a good student, a reliable helper, a quiet presence. These descriptors were sufficient. She did not dwell on her origins. Her early childhood felt distant, unreal, as if it belonged to someone else. Memory had a way of shedding details that were no longer useful. She did not romanticize her parents, nor did she resent them. They had existed. They had disappeared. The sequence felt complete. What lingered was not grief, but orientation. She had been shaped by impermanence, and she had adapted accordingly. As she approached the end of her schooling, the question of her future became unavoidable. The Toppans discussed it in practical terms. Jane listened from the edges of rooms, absorbing tone as much as content. She was not invited into the decision-making process, but she did not expect to be. Domestic service was the default path for girls like her. It was respectable enough, predictable, and kept women in their place. But the Toppans hesitated. Jane was capable, intelligent, disciplined. They saw no reason to waste those qualities entirely. Nursing re-emerged in conversation. It was spoken of as demanding, unpleasant work, long hours, unpleasant sights, low pay. But it was also framed as respectable, even noble. It required training. It offered independence of a sort. It allowed a woman to earn her keep without attaching herself to a household indefinitely. Jane listened carefully. Hospitals, she learned, were structured environments. Hierarchical. Rule-bound. They valued obedience, endurance, and discretion. Nurses were expected to suppress their own needs in service of others. Emotional excess was discouraged. Precision was rewarded. She recognized herself in this description. She did not think of nursing as a vocation. She thought of it as a system she could operate within successfully. A role that matched her internal economy. She imagined wards where routines governed behavior, schedules that dictated movement, rules that provided clarity, illness that justified proximity, patients who needed her. Need, she understood, was a form of security. As arrangements were made for her training, Jane experienced no excitement, no fear. She felt something closer to alignment. For the first time, the path ahead did not feel arbitrary. It felt structured. On the day she left the Toppan household to begin her nursing education, there was little ceremony. She was wished well. She was reminded to behave properly. She was told to remember where she came from, though no one specified which version of her past they meant. She carried few possessions. She had learned not to accumulate what could be taken. As she stepped into the world beyond Lowell, Jane did not look back. Looking back implied attachment. She moved forward instead, into institutions that would reward her strengths and ignore her absences. She did not yet know how far those institutions would allow her to go, but she had already mastered the art of watching without being seen. Chapter 5. Entering the hospital world. Boston, late 1870s to early 1880s. The hospital did not smell the way Jane had expected it to. She had imagined something sharp and medicinal, antiseptic, clean, decisive. Instead, the air was thick and layered, a composite of boiled linens, sweat, excrement, old food, carbolic soap, and sickness in its many stages. It was not unpleasant in a singular way. It was overwhelming. The smell of too many bodies in one place for too long. Massachusetts General Hospital rose from the street like an authority made visible. Its stone facade suggested permanence, knowledge, order. Inside, those ideals fractured immediately. Corridors echoed. Doors opened and closed without warning. Bells rang. Footsteps overlapped. Patients groaned. Somewhere, someone was always dying. Jane absorbed this without comment. Her nursing training began with instruction, but it was quickly apparent that observation mattered more than lectures. Rules existed, but practice bent around necessity. Senior nurses demonstrated procedures briskly, with little explanation. There was no time for reassurance. Patients needed washing, feeding, restraining, sedating. Precision mattered, but speed mattered more. Jane learned quickly that nursing was not about curing. It was about management. The wards were divided by class as much as by condition. Private patients received quiet rooms, better food, more attention. Public patients, the poor, the indigent, the unclaimed, were placed together in large wards where beds were close enough for breath to be shared. Privacy was a luxury reserved for those who could pay. Jane was assigned first to these wards. The work was relentless. Long hours on her feet. Little rest. Minimal praise. She was expected to function efficiently regardless of fatigue or disgust. Bodily fluids were everywhere. Pain was constant. Death was routine. She did not flinch. Other trainees struggled. Some cried in the linen rooms. Some fainted. Some left quietly, their ambitions unable to withstand the reality of the work. Jane watched them with mild curiosity, not superiority. Their reactions seemed inefficient to her. Emotion consumed energy without producing results. She learned the rhythms of the ward quickly. When doctors arrived. When meals were delivered. When patients were most restless. When death tended to occur, often in the early hours, when the body finally surrendered after a night of struggle. She noticed how authority operated. Doctors issued orders, but they were not always present. Nurses executed those orders and interpreted them when circumstances changed. In practice, nurses controlled the day-to-day reality of patient care. This control was informal but absolute. Medication cabinets were not secured in the way they would be in later decades. Drugs were logged, but records were inconsistent. Dosages were estimated by eye and experience rather than strict measurement. Morphine, atropine, laudanum, these substances were treated as tools, not dangers. They were used generously to ease pain, calm agitation, quiet those who disturbed the ward. Jane paid close attention. She learned how morphine softened edges, how atropine dried secretions, slowed bodily functions, altered breath. She learned how small changes in dosage produced different effects. She watched senior nurses adjust medications without consulting doctors, their authority unquestioned. This knowledge was not framed as power. It was framed as competence. Jane did not yet administer drugs independently. She observed. She assisted. She memorized. She understood that mastery came not from instruction but from pattern recognition. She watched how bodies responded. How some patients were resilient, others fragile. How illness did not behave consistently. She noticed, too, how easily symptoms could be explained away. Vomiting, weakness, confusion, these were common in the wards. Poor patients arrived malnourished, already compromised. When they worsened suddenly, no one was surprised. When they died, paperwork followed routine. Jane understood, even then, that attention was selective. Doctors lingered over unusual cases, not predictable ones. Nurses were expected to manage the predictable quietly. She was very good at quiet management. Her superiors noticed her reliability. She did not complain. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She completed tasks thoroughly and on time. When reprimanded, she adjusted immediately. When praised, which was rare, she acknowledged it without visible pride. She became trusted. Trust brought access. Access brought proximity. Proximity brought knowledge. Jane learned where supplies were kept. She learned which cabinets were checked regularly and which were not. She learned which doctors noticed discrepancies and which assumed errors were clerical. She learned that most oversight was performative rather than rigorous. She did not yet think of this in terms of opportunity. It registered instead as understanding. The system made sense to her. It behaved according to rules she could predict. Emotionally, she remained contained. She did not bond with patients in the way nursing manuals encouraged. She did not offer unnecessary comfort. She was efficient, present, attentive. Patients often liked her because she was calm. She did not recoil from their bodies. She did not rush. She would later describe this period as unremarkable. It was anything but. This was where she learned the language of care, not as compassion, but as procedure. This was where she learned that intimacy could exist without affection, and that authority could be exercised quietly. She noticed how patients looked at nurses. With dependence. With gratitude. With fear. The nurse was the one who stayed when doctors left. the one who controlled pain, the one who decided when to respond to a bell, and when to let it ring. Jane did not abuse this power. Not yet. But she noticed how it felt to hold it. At night, when the ward quieted and only the most serious cases remained restless, she sometimes stood beside beds and watched breathing patterns. The rise and fall of chests. The pauses between breaths. The moment when effort gave way to exhaustion. She felt no urge to intervene beyond what was required. But she felt a sense of clarity. The body, stripped of pretense, behaved according to rules. Those rules could be learned. This was not fascination with death. It was comfort with predictability. By the time she completed her training, Jane had distinguished herself not through brilliance, but through endurance. She had proven she could tolerate what others could not. She had shown she could function within institutional constraints without pushing against them. She was exactly the kind of nurse hospitals needed, and exactly the kind of nurse no one questioned. As she moved from trainee to practitioner, Jane did not feel pride. Pride implied a narrative of achievement. She felt instead a sense of placement. She was where she belonged. The hospital had given her structure, authority, and access. It had also given her something else, though she did not yet name it. It had shown her how invisible power could be. And it had shown her how little the world noticed, as long as everything appeared to be in order. Chapter 6. The Tools of Mercy. Boston, early to mid-1880s. Jane learned the names of the drugs before she learned to fear them. Morphine, atropine, laudanum, chloral hydrate. Each was introduced as an answer to suffering, a means of easing pain that medicine could not yet cure. They were spoken of with respect, but not reverence. These substances were not treated as dangerous in themselves. Danger lay in excess, in carelessness, in ignorance, not in the compounds. Jane was not careless. She was not ignorant. Medication was woven into the daily fabric of the ward. Bottles lined shelves in the treatment room, their labels worn soft from handling. Powders were measured by spoon or eye, liquids poured with a practiced tilt of the wrist. Precision existed, but it was personal rather than procedural. Dosage depended on experience, judgment, and trust. Jane paid attention to all three. Morphine was the most common. It softened the sharp edges of pain, slowed breathing, calmed agitation. Patients who had screamed became quiet. Patients who had fought restraint lay still. Nurses spoke of it with relief, a small mercy in a job that offered few. Jane noticed how morphine changed the atmosphere of a room. How it hushed not just the patient, but the space around them. Fewer bells rang. Fewer voices rose. Order was restored. Atropine was used more selectively. It dried secretions, eased respiratory distress, altered heart rate. It was discussed with more caution, but still without alarm. When administered properly, it improved comfort. When misjudged, it produced confusion, restlessness, irregular breathing. Jane noticed that too. She noticed how bodies reacted differently. How some patients tolerated doses easily, while others responded dramatically to small amounts. She noticed how age, weight, illness, and fatigue altered outcomes. She noticed that charts rarely captured these nuances. They recorded intent, not effect. She learned to watch for signs doctors did not always see. The slight change in color around the mouth. The altered cadence of breath. The moment when drowsiness tipped into something deeper. She learned when to act, and when not to. Laudanum, an opium tincture, was everywhere. It was used for pain, for coughs, for sleeplessness, for nerves. It was given to children and adults alike, its dangers largely unacknowledged. Jane had seen laudanum before, in domestic settings, administered casually by mothers and caretakers. In the hospital, it carried institutional legitimacy. What struck her most was not the power of the drugs, but the casualness of their handling. Medication cabinets were unlocked during shifts. Bottles were refilled without ceremony. Records were kept, but they were secondary to immediate need. A nurse's judgment was rarely questioned unless something went visibly wrong. Jane understood that invisibility was built into the system. She began administering medications independently under supervision, then without it. Senior nurses trusted her. She was calm, efficient, and did not overstep. Doctors rarely hovered. They issued orders and moved on. Nurses executed them and interpreted them in real time. Jane discovered that interpretation was where authority lived. She followed instructions precisely, outwardly. But she also observed how often instructions were vague. As needed. To comfort. To calm. These phrases granted nurses enormous discretion. Comfort was subjective. Calm was negotiable. Jane did not abuse this discretion. Not in any way that could be named. But she began to understand how flexible it was. At night, when wards quieted and supervision thinned, she paid closer attention to the interplay between drug and body. She watched how morphine slowed breathing. How atropine altered pulse. How patients drifted in and out of consciousness. She noticed that death did not arrive dramatically. It was often subtle. A slowing. A pause that lasted just a little too long. A moment when effort ceased. No alarms sounded. No bells rang. Death, she learned, could be quiet. She did not feel tempted. Not yet. What she felt was clarity. A sense that she understood something fundamental about how the world worked, something most people avoided thinking about. Pain was disruptive. Relief restored order. Death ended struggle entirely. These were not moral conclusions. They were observations. Jane's emotional response to this knowledge was muted. She did not feel horror or excitement. She felt competence. Mastery. She understood the tools she had been given and the trust that accompanied them. She also understood the hierarchy of attention. Patients who improved were praised. Patients who declined were pitied briefly, then absorbed into routine. Poor patients, in particular, passed through the system quickly. Their suffering was expected. Their deaths were not investigated. Jane did not see this as cruelty. She saw it as efficiency. She noticed that nurses who questioned outcomes too often were viewed as disruptive. Doubt slowed the work. Certainty kept it moving. Jane learned to be certain. As months passed, she grew more confident. She handled medication with ease. She anticipated doctors' orders before they were spoken. She adjusted care without drawing attention to herself. She became indispensable. Patients often remarked on her calm, on her steady presence. Some said they felt better when she was near. Jane accepted these comments without reaction. Comfort was part of the role. But something else had begun to take shape beneath the surface of her days. She had spent her life adapting to systems she did not control. Childhood had taught her that people disappeared without warning. Adolescence had taught her that identity could be rewritten. Nursing taught her something new. Here, for the first time, she was not merely adapting. She was deciding. Deciding when pain would be eased. Deciding when agitation would be quieted. Deciding when to respond immediately and when to wait. These decisions were framed as care, and they were. But they were also acts of authority. Jane did not articulate this as power. Power implied intention, ambition. She experienced it instead as stability, predictability, a sense that outcomes could be managed. She slept well during this period. Her days were structured. Her nights were quiet. She did not dream much. She did not yet cross any lines. She did not need to. The knowledge that she could, that the system would not immediately stop her, was enough. The tools of mercy sat patiently on the shelves, waiting. Jane understood them now. And understanding, she had learned long ago, was the first step to control. Chapter 7. Learning How Patients Die. Boston, mid to late 1880s. Death, Jane discovered, had habits. It arrived differently depending on where it was expected. In the public wards, it came often and with little ceremony. In private rooms, it was negotiated, delayed, sometimes resisted fiercely. But in all cases, it followed patterns that revealed themselves to those who watched closely enough. Jane watched. She had learned the official narratives: heart failure, pneumonia, wasting disease, complications. These were the terms written into charts, spoken aloud during rounds, accepted without question. But beneath those explanations lay something more instructive: the sequence of decline, the moments when intervention mattered, and the moments when it did not. She began to notice how the body gave up. Not suddenly, as people imagined, but incrementally. Breath shortened. Muscles weakened. Attention drifted. Patients stopped asking for things. Then they stopped noticing when they were not given. This was the point at which nurses became most important. Doctors visited less frequently as prognosis worsened. Their work was diagnostic and prescriptive. Once the trajectory was set, there was little more for them to do. Nurses remained. Nurses decided whether discomfort was tolerable or required relief. Nurses decided whether agitation warranted sedation. Nurses decided how much attention a patient received in their final days. Jane understood that these decisions were rarely scrutinized. She observed how some nurses avoided dying patients, preferring the satisfaction of recovery to the discomfort of decline. Others lingered, offering kindness that bordered on performance. Jane did neither. She treated the dying with the same efficiency she offered everyone else. Patients did not find this cold. Many found it reassuring. She noticed how patients spoke differently as death approached. Some became nostalgic, recounting fragments of their lives to anyone who would listen. Others withdrew entirely, turning inward. A few became demanding, angry, resentful of the attention their condition attracted too late. Jane listened when it was useful. She did not encourage confession. She did not discourage it. Stories, she had learned, did not change outcomes. What changed outcomes were bodies and substances. She paid close attention to cases where death was misjudged. Patients expected to recover who did not. Patients expected to die who rallied briefly before collapsing again. These anomalies interested her. They revealed the fragility of prediction. She learned which symptoms caused alarm and which were dismissed. Vomiting was common. Confusion was common. Irregular breathing was common. Pain was constant. When poor patients exhibited these signs, they blended into the background noise of the ward. Jane began to understand that visibility was not tied to severity, but to expectation. A young patient declining rapidly drew attention. An elderly one did not. A well-dressed patient's distress prompted consultation. A laborer's did not. The system responded not to suffering itself, but to deviation from assumed trajectories. Jane stored this knowledge carefully. She also learned how death was recorded. Time of death was often approximate. Causes were sometimes inferred rather than confirmed. Autopsies were rare, especially for the poor. Families, if present at all, were grateful for explanations that did not invite questions. Jane saw how easily paperwork closed lives. She did not yet imagine herself altering outcomes. But she began to recognize that outcomes were already malleable. Medicine, despite its authority, was imprecise. Nursing filled the gaps. She noticed that nurses who raised concerns about dying patients were sometimes seen as hysterical or inefficient. The expectation was not vigilance, but smooth operation. The ward needed to function. Deaths needed to be processed without disruption. Jane was very good at preventing disruption. At night, when the ward dimmed and supervision slackened, she allowed herself to observe more closely. She stood beside beds longer. She timed breaths. She noted how long it took for consciousness to fade after medication was administered. She observed the threshold between sleep and unconsciousness. She did not touch. She did not alter doses. She did not test boundaries. But she learned where the boundaries were. She learned how long a patient could be left before anyone checked on them. She learned which bells were answered immediately and which were tolerated for minutes at a time. She learned that the absence of response did not necessarily indicate neglect. Sometimes it indicated prioritization. These lessons were not moral in her mind. They were logistical. Jane's emotional response to death remained muted. She did not grieve patience. She did not feel triumph. She felt resolution. Death ended uncertainty. It simplified. This was not cruelty. It was orientation. Jane had grown up in a world where uncertainty was the most dangerous condition of all. Death, by contrast, was final and therefore stable. She began to understand why some patients seemed calmer near the end. Why resistance faded. Why relief, chemical or otherwise, was welcomed. She noticed that families often deferred entirely to nurses during these moments. Doctors were not always present. Clergy arrived late or not at all. The nurse was the one who stayed. Jane recognized the intimacy of this role. The nurse was the last constant. The witness. She did not yet see herself as actor. but she began to feel the weight of proximity. To be present at death repeatedly, without consequence, altered something subtle in her perception. It taught her that death was not an event, but a process. And processes, she had learned, could be managed. When she reflected on her own past, which she did rarely, she saw parallels. Her mother's slow decline. Her father's gradual disappearance. Endings had never been abrupt in her life. They had been prolonged, quiet, absorbed into routine. Jane did not recoil from this recognition. She felt a faint sense of coherence. As her experience deepened, she became more trusted, more relied upon. Junior nurses deferred to her. Senior nurses left her in charge during difficult shifts. Doctors recognized her name, if not her face. She had become part of the institution. The hospital did not know her thoughts. It did not need to. It required only that she functioned. And she did. By the end of this period, Jane had learned something essential, something no textbook taught and no lecture articulated. Patients did not die because nurses failed. They died because death was expected. And expectation was rarely questioned. She did not yet intend to exploit this truth. But she understood it. And understanding, in her experience, always preceded action. Chapter 8. The First Experiment. Boston, late 1880s. No record survives of Jane Toppan's first patient. There is no name in a ledger that can be pointed to with certainty. No age written neatly beside a cause of death. No family testimony preserved in a newspaper column. If there was an entry at all, it would have been unremarkable, another poor body processed through a system designed to keep moving. This absence is not accidental. It is the condition that made what followed possible. Jane did not wake one morning with the intention to kill. There was no rupture, no moment of decision that could later be dramatized. What occurred instead was incremental, almost procedural, an adjustment within a framework she already understood. The patient was elderly. That much is consistent with later patterns. Likely poor, likely admitted without family advocacy, likely suffering from a chronic condition that blurred the boundary between illness and dying. The ward would have expected decline. The chart would have reflected that expectation. Jane was assigned to their care. She would have begun as she always did, efficiently, competently, without unnecessary softness. She would have noted respiration, pulse, color. She would have administered medication according to orders that were broad enough to permit discretion. For pain. As needed. To keep the patient comfortable. Comfort was a flexible term. Jane had spent years observing how bodies responded to drugs. She knew how much morphine calmed without alarming. She knew how atropine altered breathing. She knew that nausea, confusion, and weakness were common enough to pass without comment. The first deviation was slight. Perhaps a dose given a little closer together than usual. Perhaps a quantity measured with confidence rather than caution. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could not be explained away. The patient worsened, as expected. No alarm was raised. Jane watched. She did not panic. She did not rush to undo what she had done. She observed the body's response with the same focus she had applied countless times before. The patient became quieter. Breathing slowed. Agitation faded. No one questioned her actions. No one hovered. The patient died. The death did not feel different to Jane than any other she had witnessed. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of guilt. What she felt instead was confirmation. The knowledge she had accumulated was not theoretical. It worked. This was not yet murder in the way history would later define it. It was closer to verification, proof that the system behaved as she understood it to behave. The paperwork was completed. The body was removed. The bed was stripped. Another patient took its place. Life in the ward continued without disruption. Jane did not think of herself as having crossed a line. The line, she had learned, was not fixed. It moved depending on who was watching, who cared, and who mattered. She did not repeat the act immediately. There was no urgency. She did not need to. The knowledge that she could act, that she could alter outcomes without consequence, settled into her like a new organ, quietly changing the balance of her internal world. Over time, she refined the process. She learned which patients drew scrutiny and which did not. She learned that the very sick were paradoxically safer targets than the moderately ill, whose decline might raise questions. She learned that timing mattered, that deaths late at night attracted less attention than those during rounds. She learned that intervention could be staggered. A patient could be worsened, then stabilized, then worsened again. Recovery and decline could be orchestrated just enough to confuse interpretation. This was where her behavior diverged from accident and entered pattern. Jane did not see this as cruelty. She did not frame it as violence. In her mind, she was exercising judgment, the same judgment nurses were trusted to apply every day. She was deciding when suffering ended. The patients she chose did not resist in ways that troubled her. Many were already resigned. Some were grateful for relief, even if they did not understand its source. Jane interpreted this gratitude not as approval, but as alignment. She believed, and this belief would later harden into conviction, that she was better positioned than anyone else to decide how and when certain lives ended. Doctors were distant. Families were absent or powerless. The institution itself prioritized order over inquiry. Jane was present. Jane was attentive. Jane knew what she was doing. This internal reasoning did not arrive fully formed. It developed gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by silence. Each death that passed without comment strengthened her confidence. Each chart closed without scrutiny validated her understanding. The absence of consequence became its own permission. It is important to note what she did not do during this period. She did not boast. She did not confess. She did not behave erratically. She continued to perform her duties with precision. She remained reliable, calm, indispensable. Her colleagues trusted her. Patients found her soothing. Doctors relied on her reports. The system did not merely fail to stop her. It endorsed her. Only later, when she moved into private nursing and began caring for patients with social standing, would names begin to attach themselves to her actions. Only then would records survive with enough clarity to reconstruct individual deaths. Those names, which will appear in later chapters, include Annette Jones, a young woman whose death in 1899 would finally draw suspicion. Members of the Dunham family, including Israel Dunham, whose poisoning would expose a pattern impossible to ignore. But in the wards where Jane learned what she was capable of, names did not matter. Age mattered only insofar as it shaped expectation. Poverty mattered more. Her earliest victims were protected by nothing more than anonymity. By the time Jane understood that she was killing, not experimenting, not easing suffering, but deciding death, the act itself no longer felt transgressive. It felt consistent. She had spent her life learning how to disappear into systems larger than herself. Now she had learned how to act within one, unseen. The first experiment had not changed the world. It had changed Jane. And it had taught her the most dangerous lesson of all. That she could end a life, quietly, and nothing would happen. Chapter 9. Private Rooms, Private Authority. Boston and surrounding towns, early 1890s. The move into private nursing felt less like a promotion than a release. Hospitals were structured, predictable, governed by routines Jane understood intimately. But they were also crowded with witnesses. Even when supervision was lax, proximity itself created limits. Private nursing removed those limits almost entirely. Families who could afford a private nurse wanted one thing above all else: reassurance. They wanted someone who appeared competent, calm, and unwavering, someone who would take responsibility so they did not have to. Jane provided this with ease. She arrived neatly dressed, composed, deferential without being submissive. She spoke softly, with certainty rather than warmth. Families trusted her almost immediately. Trust, she had learned, was not built through intimacy but through confidence. Private sick rooms were different from wards in subtle but important ways. The pace was slower. The environment quieter. There were fewer interruptions. Fewer eyes. Medication cabinets were often kept in the patient's room, accessible without explanation. Doctors visited briefly, issued instructions, and left. The nurse remained. Jane was now the constant. She adjusted easily to the intimacy of these spaces. Sick rooms were domestic, familiar, stripped of institutional noise. Patients lay in their own beds, surrounded by objects from their lives: photographs, books, furniture worn smooth by years of use. Families hovered anxiously, then withdrew when exhaustion set in. Jane stepped into that vacuum without effort. She learned the rhythms of households quickly. When family members slept. When they left the room. When servants were distracted. She learned which families wanted detailed updates and which preferred general assurances. She learned how to manage concern, how to calm suspicion before it had a chance to form. She became indispensable. Her authority in these spaces was absolute but invisible. Families deferred to her judgment on matters they did not understand: medication schedules, symptoms, expected progression. Doctors deferred as well, trusting her reports as accurate reflections of the patient's condition. Jane did not distort information. She curated it. She selected which symptoms to emphasize and which to minimize. She learned that language mattered. Comfortable, reassured. Resting, closed conversations. A difficult night explained decline without inviting intervention. She noticed how eagerly families accepted these explanations. They wanted certainty. They wanted someone to take control. Jane obliged. The first private patient whose death she influenced deliberately is difficult to identify with certainty. Records exist, but they are fragmented, filtered through later confessions and retrospective suspicion. What is clear is that by this stage, Jane no longer acted out of curiosity. She acted out of coherence. Her reasoning had solidified into a private logic that made sense to her, even as it violated the moral frameworks of others. She believed, sincerely, that she was better equipped than anyone else in the room to decide how suffering ended. She was present. She was attentive. She understood the tools. Families, in her view, prolonged suffering out of fear. Doctors deferred out of habit. Jane saw herself as correcting imbalance. When she adjusted dosages now, it was not tentative. It was intentional. She learned to pace the process. To worsen symptoms gradually, allowing decline to appear organic. She learned to stagger medications so that no single dose appeared responsible. She learned how to create crises that resolved, followed by ones that did not. Sometimes she revived patients deliberately, pulling them back from the edge she had guided them toward. This reinforced trust. Families marveled at her skill. Doctors praised her vigilance. Jane absorbed this praise without reaction. Praise was irrelevant. What mattered was control. The intimacy of private nursing altered something subtle in her internal world. In hospitals, death had been routine, almost abstract. In private rooms, it became personal, not emotionally, but structurally. Each patient represented a closed system she could manage entirely. She learned their habits, their fears, their family dynamics. She learned who visited and who did not. She learned which lives were tightly woven into others and which were already unraveled. She chose accordingly. Older patients, isolated patients, those whose deaths would not disrupt inheritance or reputation, these were safest. Jane did not target randomly. She selected patients whose absence would not provoke investigation. Her choices were pragmatic, not impulsive. She did not hurry. She had learned patience long ago. She allowed months to pass between deaths if necessary. There was no compulsion driving her. There was only alignment. Jane's behavior outside the sick room remained unremarkable. She socialized minimally. She drank occasionally, without excess. She maintained professional relationships without intimacy. There were no visible cracks in her composure. This consistency was her greatest protection. When patients died under her care, families often expressed gratitude. They thanked her for her kindness, her devotion, her presence. Jane accepted these thanks politely. She did not correct their assumptions. She understood something most people did not: gratitude does not require truth. It requires relief. The relief families felt was real. Suffering had ended. Uncertainty had resolved. Jane saw no contradiction in accepting thanks for outcomes she had engineered. She did not experience guilt. Guilt implied wrongdoing. In her mind, she was performing a function the system quietly demanded but publicly denied. Someone had to decide when enough was enough. Jane believed that someone should be the person who stayed. As her reputation grew, she was recommended to new families. Each recommendation expanded her access. Each new household offered a fresh set of variables to observe and manage. She refined her methods. She became more confident. She made fewer mistakes. What she did not do was consider consequences beyond the immediate. The system had taught her that consequences arrived only when expectation was violated. As long as deaths followed plausible trajectories, nothing would happen. For a long time, she was right. Private nursing had given Jane exactly what she had spent her life preparing for: autonomy without scrutiny, intimacy without attachment, authority without accountability. It also brought her closer unknowingly to the moment when names would begin to matter, when deaths would no longer disappear quietly into ledgers, and patterns would become visible. But for now, in these private rooms, Jane Toppan operated in near-perfect alignment with the world she inhabited. She was trusted. She was needed. And she was unseen. Chapter 10. Names, Rooms, Medicines. Massachusetts, 1895 to 1899. Once Jane began private nursing in earnest, names started to cling to her work. They arrived quietly at first, attached to rooms rather than stories: bedrooms on the second floor of respectable houses, spare rooms converted into sick rooms, parlors thick with the smell of boiled water and damp cloth. These were not anonymous ward beds. These were homes, and the people in them had histories that survived their deaths. Jane adjusted to this without difficulty. She entered households through recommendation. A doctor suggested her. A neighbor praised her steadiness. A family, exhausted and afraid, accepted her presence gratefully. She arrived with a small case, her manner composed, her voice calm. She asked the right questions. She did not ask too many. She learned each household quickly. Who held authority? Who hovered? Who left the room when illness became uncomfortable? She learned how grief was likely to express itself before it arrived. Her first clearly traceable victims were not chosen for who they were, but for what they represented: closed systems. Lives already narrowing. Families willing to defer. One of these was Mary McNear, a woman in her 60s, chronically ill and increasingly dependent. Mary lived alone for much of her life, her health deteriorating slowly, her social circle shrinking. By the time Jane entered her life as a nurse, Mary's world had already contracted to the dimensions of a single room. Jane's presence was welcomed without reservation. Mary suffered from ongoing pain and weakness, symptoms common enough to require little explanation. Jane administered morphine regularly, increasing doses incrementally. Morphine was not unusual, it was expected. What mattered was not its presence, but its calibration. Jane learned how much Mary could tolerate without alarming signs. She observed the subtle shift from drowsiness to suppression. She allowed periods of improvement, enough to reassure any visiting doctor, followed by decline that appeared organic. When Mary died, the cause was recorded without suspicion. Chronic illness. Heart failure. Complications. Jane remained with the body until it was removed. She closed Mary's eyes gently. She packed her case and left. No one questioned her. Another patient, Elizabeth McNear, Mary's sister, entered Jane's care soon after. The connection was not coincidence. Jane understood how familiarity bred trust. Elizabeth, already grieving, welcomed the nurse who had been so present during her sister's final days. Elizabeth was not terminal in the same way. She was ill, but not immediately dying. This required adjustment. Jane slowed the process. She introduced atropine alongside morphine, careful to stagger doses so that symptoms overlapped with existing complaints. Dry mouth. Confusion. Irregular pulse. These were not alarming in isolation. Together, they suggested deterioration. Jane monitored Elizabeth closely, sometimes reviving her deliberately by withholding medication just long enough to create improvement. This deepened trust. Families believe in nurses who can pull patients back from the brink. When Elizabeth finally died, the progression appeared consistent with prolonged illness. 2 sisters gone within months was unfortunate, but not unheard of. Jane was thanked for her care. The deaths accumulated quietly. Then came Annette Jones. Annette was different. Younger. In her 20s. Not chronically ill in the way Jane's previous patients had been. Annette lived with Jane as a boarder, a detail that would later draw scrutiny. She had complained of vague symptoms, weakness, nausea, confusion, that did not resolve. Jane had access to her constantly. The medicines used were familiar. Morphine for discomfort. Atropine in small quantities, enough to produce instability without obvious cause. Jane controlled Annette's food, her drink, her rest. She monitored her reactions closely, adjusting as needed. Annette's decline was not rapid, but it was perplexing. Doctors were consulted. Diagnoses were uncertain. Jane's reports guided interpretation. She emphasized symptoms that supported organic illness and minimized those that suggested interference. Annette died in 1899. Her death did not go unnoticed in the same way as earlier ones. She was young. She had been living with the nurse. The circumstances were unusual enough to invite quiet speculation, though not immediate action. Jane moved on. The most consequential household she entered was that of Israel Dunham. Dunham was a retired sea captain, middle-aged, financially comfortable, living with his wife and adult daughters. He was not poor. He was not isolated. His family was attentive, involved, present. This made him a risk Jane had previously avoided. But Jane's confidence had grown. Dunham suffered from unspecified illness, fatigue, digestive complaints, intermittent pain. Nothing immediately fatal. Jane was brought in to manage his care. She began cautiously. Morphine was introduced gradually. Atropine followed, carefully timed. Dunham's symptoms worsened unpredictably. He rallied, then declined. Doctors were puzzled. Jane's reports framed the fluctuations as typical of his condition. What Jane underestimated was the Dunham family's attentiveness. When Israel Dunham died, grief was immediate and intense. But suspicion followed quickly. His wife fell ill soon after, under Jane's care. Then one of his daughters. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The medicines used were the same. The logic unchanged. But the context had shifted. These were not anonymous patients. These were members of a single household dying in succession. Jane did not panic. She remained composed, helpful, present. She assisted doctors. She answered questions calmly. But the system that had protected her among the poor and isolated began to resist her here. Autopsies were ordered. Atropine was detected. Morphine was detected. For the first time, Jane's careful calibrations were subjected to scrutiny she had never faced. The quiet assumptions that had carried her this far no longer held. What is striking, in retrospect, is how consistent her methods had been across all these cases. She did not improvise wildly. She relied on the same substances, the same logic, the same understanding of human physiology and institutional behavior. She had not changed. The world around her had. When she was finally confronted with the evidence, with the names, the bodies, the records laid out, Jane did not deny what she had done. She explained it. Her explanations would later be filtered, sensationalized, reduced to pathology. But at their core, they reflected the logic she had been developing for years. She believed she had acted appropriately. She believed she had ended suffering. She believed she had done what others could not. The difference now was that the people she had killed mattered to those with the power to ask questions. And that, more than any change in her behavior, is what brought her career as a nurse to an end. Chapter 11. Control feels like relief. Massachusetts, 1899 to 1901. By the time suspicion began to circle her, Jane Toppan had already settled into a private understanding of herself that no accusation could easily dislodge. She did not experience her actions as a departure from nursing. She experienced them as its logical extension. The work had always been about managing bodies that would not cooperate, alleviating pain medicine could not cure, and guiding patients through an end that medicine had already conceded. Jane believed she was simply more honest about that process than most. Where others hesitated, she acted. Where others deferred, she decided. Control to her did not feel violent. It felt clarifying. She had never tolerated uncertainty well. Childhood had taught her that waiting solved nothing, that absence lingered indefinitely unless something intervened. Nursing had offered her an antidote to that chaos, a world governed by dosage, timing, and response. Cause and effect, at last, behaved predictably. Each patient she killed reinforced this internal order. She did not select victims impulsively. She assessed risk the way other nurses assessed symptoms. Age, social standing, family involvement, medical history, all of these factors were weighed carefully. She understood that the system responded not to harm itself, but to deviations from expectation. The poor were expected to die. The elderly were expected to decline. The isolated were expected to disappear quietly. Jane did not challenge those expectations. She worked within them. Her reasoning, as she would later articulate it, was not rooted in hatred or rage. She did not speak of resentment toward her patients. She did not describe anger at families or doctors. What she described instead was a sense of inevitability, that certain lives were already moving toward death, and that prolonging that movement served no meaningful purpose. In her mind, she was not taking life. She was abbreviating suffering. This belief hardened over time into conviction. She began to see herself as uniquely qualified to make these decisions because she was the one who stayed. Doctors came and went. Families hovered, then retreated. Jane remained at the bedside, night after night, watching bodies exhaust themselves in incremental failure. She came to view death as a form of resolution. This did not make her careless. On the contrary, it made her meticulous. She understood that the legitimacy of her role depended on restraint. She could not act indiscriminately. She could not allow patterns to emerge too clearly. Control required discipline. Her methods remained consistent. Morphine was her primary instrument, familiar, expected, widely accepted. It eased pain, quieted resistance, softened awareness. Administered gradually, it attracted no attention. In combination with atropine, it became more effective. Atropine destabilized the body quietly, altering heart rate and respiration in ways that mimicked natural decline. She staggered doses carefully. She avoided single catastrophic administrations. She created trajectories rather than events. Sometimes she intervened to reverse a decline she had initiated. These reversals served a purpose. They reassured families. They reinforced her reputation. They proved to herself that she controlled the process, not the other way around. This oscillation, worsen, improve, worsen, became part of her internal logic. It allowed her to maintain the appearance of attentive care while exercising authority over outcomes. Jane did not record these choices in charts. She documented symptoms, not causes. She used the language the system provided: restless, comfortable, declining. These words carried meaning without specificity. They closed conversations. She understood that institutions functioned on such language. It allowed work to continue without friction. As her confidence grew, so did her sense of entitlement. She began to believe that her presence at a bedside conferred ownership. She was the one managing pain, fear, confusion. She was the one guiding patients through their final hours. Families trusted her. Doctors deferred to her reports. The system rewarded her composure. Why, she asked herself privately, should others decide what she was already doing? This was not grandiosity in the conventional sense. Jane did not imagine herself powerful in a public way. She did not seek recognition. She did not crave admiration. Her sense of authority was intimate, bounded by rooms and beds and breathing bodies. She wanted control because control felt like safety. For someone whose life had been shaped by disappearance and uncertainty, the ability to dictate an ending, even a quiet one, provided relief. Endings no longer arrived without explanation. They occurred because she permitted them. When questioned later about her feelings during these acts, Jane struggled to articulate emotion in the way others expected. She did not describe pleasure or remorse. She spoke instead of calm, of rightness, of a sense that things were proceeding as they should. This baffled those who examined her. They searched for hysteria, for perversion, for madness that could be neatly categorized. What they encountered instead was a woman whose internal logic was consistent, if deeply disturbing. Jane did not believe she was above the system. She believed she embodied it. The breakdown came not from within her, but from outside. The Dunham household had introduced variables she could not fully control. Too many observers. Too much continuity between deaths. Too much social weight attached to the bodies she left behind. When suspicion surfaced, it did so quietly at first. A doctor puzzled over inconsistent symptoms. A family member noticed the pattern of illness following Jane's arrival. A colleague remembered an odd detail that now felt significant. Jane sensed the shift. She did not flee. She did not destroy evidence. She did not alter her demeanor. Panic, she had learned long ago, was inefficient. Panic attracted attention. She continued to nurse. She continued to speak calmly. She continued to explain symptoms with confidence. But beneath this composure, something adjusted. For the first time, she recognized that her understanding of the system might no longer protect her. Not because it was flawed, but because it had limits. The same assumptions that shielded her among the poor now endangered her among the respectable. The difference was not in what she had done. It was in who had died. As the net began to tighten, as doctors consulted one another, as autopsies were ordered, as chemical analysis revealed what clinical observation had missed, Jane did not experience fear in the way others expected. She experienced disappointment. Not in herself, but in the system that had encouraged her precision, rewarded her composure, and then recoiled when its implications became undeniable. Control had felt like relief. Now relief was slipping from her grasp. And for the first time since childhood, Jane was no longer certain she could decide how the story ended. Chapter 12. The Pattern Breaks. Massachusetts, early 1901. Suspicion did not arrive with force. It arrived as hesitation. Jane noticed it first in the way conversations paused when she entered a room. Not stopped, paused. A fractional delay before speech resumed, just long enough to register. She noticed it in the way doctors reread their own notes, as if expecting them to say something different the second time. She noticed it in the questions that circled symptoms instead of addressing them directly. None of this alarmed her immediately. Institutions hesitated all the time. Doubt was common, action was rare. But this hesitation was new in one crucial way: it was shared. The deaths within the Dunham household had created a density of grief that could not be dispersed quietly. Israel Dunham's illness had not followed a single comprehensible line. His decline was punctuated by moments of apparent recovery that confused doctors and distressed his family. When his wife fell ill shortly after his death, then one of their daughters, the sequence could no longer be attributed to chance without strain. Jane had anticipated questions. She had prepared explanations. What she had not anticipated was comparison. Doctors began speaking to one another outside the household. Notes were exchanged. Timelines were reconstructed. Patterns emerged that had been invisible when each death stood alone. Jane sensed the shift in authority almost immediately. Where once her reports had been accepted without comment, they were now followed by silence. Where once doctors nodded and moved on, they now lingered, eyes flicking between the patient and Jane's face. They asked her to repeat dosages. They asked her to clarify times. She answered calmly, precisely, without defensiveness. She had no reason to be defensive. Everything she had done had been framed as care. But the frame was cracking. The decision to conduct autopsies marked a turning point. It was not routine. It was an escalation. Jane recognized it as such the moment she heard. Chemical analysis was still an imprecise science, but it was improving. Atropine, in particular, left traces that could not be explained away easily when present in sufficient quantity. When the results came back, they did not accuse. They suggested. Jane was questioned informally at first. The setting was polite, professional. She was asked about her training, her experience, her familiarity with medications. She answered without hesitation. She had nothing to hide in the way they imagined hiding to look, no secret drawers, no forged records, no frantic evasions. Her confidence unsettled them. When the questioning grew more pointed, Jane did not retreat. She did not plead ignorance. She explained. She described symptoms. She described progression. She described care decisions as any competent nurse might. What she did not do was express shock. This, more than anything else, disturbed those listening. There was no rupture in her narrative. No denial. No outrage at the implication. She spoke as though they were discussing technique rather than death. Eventually, the questions shifted. Why had so many patients declined suddenly under her care? Why had improvement often preceded collapse? Why did similar symptoms recur across unrelated cases? Jane listened. She answered what was asked. She did not volunteer what was not. When arrest finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. There were no crowds. No dramatic confrontation. She was informed that she was being taken into custody for questioning related to multiple deaths. She complied without resistance. She gathered her belongings carefully, as she always did. She did not ask where she was going. The journey to the station was quiet. Jane did not experience fear in the way the officers expected. Fear required uncertainty. She understood perfectly what was happening. The system had reached the limit of its tolerance for ambiguity. The deaths she had orchestrated could no longer be absorbed quietly. What she did experience was a peculiar clarity. The rules had changed. She had not. In custody, the tone shifted quickly from inquiry to accusation. Names were introduced: the McNear sisters, Annette Jones, Israel Dunham, others whose deaths had been re-examined in light of new information. Timelines were laid out. Medication records compared. Jane listened attentively. When she was finally asked directly whether she had poisoned her patients, she did not deny it. She paused, considering the question as if it required precision rather than defense. Then she answered. Yes, she said. The word landed heavily in the room. Confession was not expected. Not like this. Not without preamble or protest. She elaborated when prompted. She spoke of suffering, of inevitability, of the burden of watching bodies fail while families clung to hope that medicine could not justify. She spoke of relief, not her own, but the patient's. She framed her actions as decisions made in the absence of better options. Her interrogators struggled to keep pace with her logic. They searched for motive in the familiar places: greed, anger, jealousy, madness. Jane offered none of these. She spoke instead of responsibility, of judgment, of care taken to its logical conclusion. When pressed about the number of deaths, she hesitated only briefly. Then she offered a figure that stunned the room. 31. The number was precise enough to suggest certainty, but large enough to suggest something else entirely. It shifted the narrative from isolated crime to pattern, from misconduct to seriality. Jane did not recant. She did not qualify. She stated the number as fact. Her calm unsettled everyone. Newspapers seized on the story quickly. They struggled to frame it. A nurse who killed was already transgressive. A woman who killed systematically, without apparent remorse, defied available categories. Journalists reached for language that could contain her: monster, fiend, demon in petticoats. Jane read some of these accounts later, with mild curiosity. They did not recognize her. What troubled her more than the language was the sudden attention to her inner life. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, all wanted to know why she had done what she had done. They assumed there must be a hidden emotional truth she had failed to disclose. Jane did not believe this. She had disclosed everything she thought mattered. As preparations were made for trial, a new narrative began to form around her, one that would ultimately spare her execution but erase her agency in a different way. The question shifted from what she had done to what she was. Was she sane? Jane listened as others debated her mind. She listened as psychiatrists prepared to explain her to the public, to reduce her logic to pathology that could be named, diagnosed, contained. She did not interrupt. For the first time in her life, she was no longer managing the system around her. The system was managing her. The pattern had broken. And with it, the quiet authority she had spent decades cultivating. What remained was interpretation. And interpretation, she was about to learn, could be just as powerful as control. Chapter 13. The Doctors Decide What She Is. Massachusetts, 1901. Jane was not taken first to a courtroom. She was taken to a room with chairs arranged carefully apart, a desk cleared of clutter, and men who introduced themselves by title rather than name. They spoke with confidence that did not require volume. Their authority came not from force, but from classification. These men were not interested in what Jane had done. They were interested in what she was. The emerging discipline of psychiatry was still uncertain of itself at the turn of the century. It borrowed language from medicine, philosophy, and moral judgment, often without acknowledging the seams between them. Insanity was not yet a stable category. It was argued, revised, contested, and applied unevenly, particularly to women. Jane became a problem they were eager to solve. She sat quietly as questions were asked. She answered carefully, but not evasively. She had nothing to gain from resistance. Resistance implied fear, and fear implied guilt of a kind she did not recognize. They asked about her childhood. She spoke of her mother's illness without sentiment, of her father's absence without anger. She described events plainly, without embellishment. The doctors exchanged glances when she did not supply the emotions they expected. They asked whether she had loved her parents. Jane considered the question seriously before answering. Love, she understood, was not a feeling that could be retrospectively applied to absence. She said she had been a child. She had been fed. She had been left. The doctors wrote notes. They asked about the Toppan household, about discipline, about education, about whether she had been mistreated. Jane said no. Not mistreated. Managed. That word made one of the doctors look up sharply. They asked about her work as a nurse. Here, Jane became more animated, not emotionally, but cognitively. She described procedures, routines, medications. She spoke fluently, precisely. She explained her decisions as professional judgments, grounded in observation and experience. She did not apologize. This unsettled them. Psychiatry, at that time, expected either hysteria or remorse from women accused of serious crimes. Jane offered neither. She did not cry. She did not dramatize her suffering. She did not beg for understanding. She explained herself as if explanation were sufficient. When they asked her why she had killed her patients, Jane answered honestly. She spoke of pain, of prolonged dying, of families who could not bear to let go, of doctors who deferred endlessly while bodies failed. She spoke of her belief that certain outcomes were inevitable, and that prolonging them served no purpose but fear. She said she had felt calm when patients died. The room shifted at that. Calm was not an acceptable emotion in this context. Calm suggested deliberation. Deliberation suggested responsibility. One of the doctors asked whether she had felt pleasure. Jane paused. She did not reject the premise outright. She examined it. Pleasure, she said, was not the correct word. Relief was closer. Relief that suffering had ended. Relief that uncertainty had resolved. Relief that something had been decided. This answer caused visible discomfort. Relief implied logic. Logic implied sanity. Sanity, in a woman who had confessed to killing dozens of patients, was dangerous. The doctors adjusted their approach. They asked about her bodily sensations during these acts. Whether she felt excitement. Whether she felt arousal. Whether she lay beside patients because she enjoyed proximity to death. Jane answered these questions with the same composure she had brought to every other. She said she lay beside patients because they were frightened and alone. She said she stayed because someone had to. She said she did not understand why they were asking about her body when the issue was her decisions. This, too, was noted. What the doctors required was a framework that removed Jane's authority without absolving the system that had empowered her. Madness offered that framework. Sexual deviance offered an even more compelling one. They began to speak among themselves, within her hearing but not to her. They used words like moral insanity, a diagnosis popular at the time for individuals whose reasoning appeared intact but whose behavior violated social norms. They discussed perversion, repression, abnormal female desire. They speculated about whether her lack of visible emotion indicated defect rather than control. Jane listened without interruption. She recognized what was happening, though she did not yet grasp its full consequence. Her explanations were being reinterpreted through a lens that assumed female violence must originate in pathology, not principle. The idea that a woman could kill systematically, calmly, and for reasons she herself articulated, however flawed, was intolerable. Better to recast her as driven by uncontrollable impulses. Better to sexualize her motives than confront the implications of her professional autonomy. Jane was subjected to examinations that blurred the line between medicine and voyeurism. Her body was discussed as evidence. Her lack of conventional femininity was noted. Her independence was pathologized. Her composure was treated as abnormal. She did not protest. Protest would have required her to accept their premise. What troubled her most was not their misinterpretation of her motives, but their disinterest in the environment that had shaped her actions. They did not ask detailed questions about nursing oversight, drug access, or institutional norms. They did not interrogate the systems that had rewarded her competence for decades. They interrogated her instead. The conclusion, when it came, was framed as mercy. Jane Toppan was declared insane. This spared her execution. It also stripped her of narrative authority. Her actions would no longer be understood as decisions made within a professional context, but as symptoms of a diseased mind. She would not be tried in the usual way. She would be committed to an asylum, where she could be contained, studied, and forgotten. Jane received this news without visible reaction. She understood what it meant. The system had found a way to end the story without examining itself. By declaring her mad, it absolved the institutions that had trusted her, the doctors who had deferred to her, the families who had handed their loved ones over to her care. Madness was a convenient endpoint. As she was led away to await transfer, Jane reflected, not with regret, but with something like irony, that she had finally lost control not because her logic failed, but because it had worked too well. She had acted consistently within the rules she had been taught. Now the rules had been rewritten, and she would spend the rest of her life inside them. Chapter 14. The Courtroom as Theatre. Massachusetts, 1902. By the time Jane entered the courtroom, she was no longer simply Jane. She was a public object, shaped by ink and rumor. Newspapers had already written her into existence for their readers. Headlines rendered her either grotesque or fascinating, sometimes both in the same sentence. She was a nurse fiend, a modern poisoner, a woman without pity. Her profession was repeated like an accusation in itself. Nurse. Nurse. Nurse, as though the word ought to have been a guarantee against what had happened, and therefore made the betrayal worse. The public did not want complexity. It wanted a story with edges sharp enough to hold. The courtroom offered that story. It offered spectacle, ritual, certainty. It took the messy ambiguity of institutional failure and reduced it to a single body at a single table. Jane sat in that body calmly. She was dressed properly, hair arranged, posture controlled. She did not slump. She did not perform frailty. She did not try to appear smaller than she was. This, in itself, was interpreted as unnatural. Women were expected to look broken in court. Jane looked composed. Composure was read as coldness. The proceedings moved with the deliberate pace of law, which pretended objectivity even as it relied on emotion. The prosecution laid out names and dates, calling witnesses to reconstruct deaths that had once passed without comment. Doctors testified about symptoms. Family members described decline. Chemists explained poisons in language that was half science, half theater, because science alone was not persuasive enough. The defense did not deny that deaths had occurred. It argued instead that Jane's mind had been defective, that her actions were not the result of reasoned choice but of illness, that she was, in the legal sense, incapable. This framing was received with relief. It allowed the courtroom to condemn her without confronting an unsettling possibility, that she might have understood exactly what she was doing. Jane listened to the testimony about herself as though it were about someone else. Not because she dissociated, but because she understood that her own inner narrative had already been taken from her. The story now belonged to others. The psychiatric experts were called. They spoke in terms that sounded clinical but carried moral weight. They described her as suffering from insanity, perversion, moral defect. They suggested that her confession, particularly the parts that hinted at emotional gratification, indicated abnormal female sexuality, an appetite that could not be controlled. They presented these theories as though they were facts. The courtroom leaned in. Male experts describing female deviance was a familiar spectacle. It reassured the audience that what had happened could be contained within pathology rather than system. If Jane was mad, then nursing remained safe. Hospitals remained trustworthy. Doctors remained authoritative. Jane watched them with mild, unreadable attention. When asked to speak, she did not deliver the performance expected of her. She did not beg for mercy. She did not plead for understanding. She did not cry for the dead. She spoke plainly. She said she had administered morphine and atropine. She said she had watched patients slip away. She said she had stayed beside them because they were frightened and alone. She said she believed she had ended suffering that medicine could not relieve. This calm articulation disturbed the court more than any lurid confession could have. It sounded too much like judgment. Too much like intention. The defense intervened quickly, steering her words back into the language of compulsion. They emphasized her childhood, her abandonment, the supposed defects in her character. They asked questions that made her sound driven by impulse rather than decision. Jane answered, but she did not fully cooperate with the frame. She did not portray herself as helpless to her own mind. She did not describe irresistible urges. She described choices. This created a fracture. The court, like the newspapers, required a single coherent narrative. Either she was a monster or she was mad. Either she was evil or she was ill. A woman who killed deliberately under the banner of care did not fit. The judge and lawyers moved to close that fracture. They relied on expert testimony. They relied on the era's assumptions about women and reason. They relied on the public's discomfort with the alternative. Ultimately, the verdict was delivered in language that sounded humane. Jane was found not guilty by reason of insanity. To the public, this was simultaneously condemnation and relief. She would not be hanged, a spectacle too straightforward for a case that had already unsettled so many assumptions. Instead, she would be removed from society, committed for life, locked away where she could be studied and forgotten. Jane received the decision without visible reaction. If she felt anything, it did not appear on her face. She had lived too long in systems where reaction invited punishment. She had learned the value of stillness. But inside, something tightened. The verdict was not mercy. It was reclassification. The law had decided that she was not a criminal in the way it understood criminals. She was a patient, a specimen, a problem to be contained rather than judged. This spared her the gallows, but it also denied her agency. It allowed the world to say, she did not choose this. She could not help it. She was not like us. Jane did not accept that. She did not see herself as helpless. She saw herself as competent, as deliberate, as someone who had acted within a system that rewarded competence and punished doubt. Now that same system had rewritten her into something else. Outside the courthouse, people argued about whether the verdict was too lenient or too harsh. Inside, the institutional machinery moved on. Papers were signed. Orders issued. Arrangements made for her transfer to an asylum. The trial, which had felt like the end of the story to the public, was not the end for Jane. It was simply the point at which the world decided what she would be called. And the name it gave her, insane, would follow her for decades, long after the newspapers stopped printing her face. As she was led away, the courtroom behind her began to empty. People spoke in relieved tones. The spectacle had concluded. The anxiety it had stirred could now be filed away. Jane walked calmly, escorted by men whose hands never quite left her arms. She understood what was happening. The world had found a way to avoid asking the most dangerous question of all. If Jane Toppan was insane, then nursing was safe. But if she was not, if she had been sane enough to observe, learn, choose, and repeat, then the system itself was implicated. The asylum doors that awaited her would not only contain her, they would contain that question. Chapter 15. Containment. Taunton State Hospital, 1902 onward. The asylum did not announce itself as a punishment. It presented itself as care. Taunton State Hospital stood apart from the world in a way that felt deliberate rather than incidental. Its buildings were large, symmetrical, orderly, architecture designed to convey rationality and control. This was not a place of chaos, despite popular imagination. It was a place of management, of classification, of long-term thinking. Jane arrived without ceremony. There were no crowds, no reporters, no final pronouncements. She was transferred quietly, her status altered by paperwork rather than force. She was no longer an accused criminal, no longer a nurse, no longer a woman with a past that required explanation. She was a patient. Her name was entered into a register. Her belongings were catalogued. Her body was examined again, height, weight, posture, expression, as though these measurements might finally reveal what earlier examinations had failed to locate. She was assigned a ward. The routine asserted itself immediately. Wake times, meals, walks, lights out. The asylum ran on predictability. Disorder was not tolerated, not because it was frightening, but because it interfered with observation. Jane adapted easily. She had lived her life within institutions. She understood how authority flowed. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent. She complied with instructions without resistance, not out of submission, but out of comprehension. Resistance would have served no purpose here. Doctors visited her regularly at first. They asked questions framed as assessments rather than conversations. How did she sleep? Did she hear voices? Did she feel urges she could not control? Did she regret her actions? Jane answered carefully. She did not claim hallucinations. She did not invent symptoms. She did not present herself as tormented by guilt. She described her inner world accurately, calm, ordered, consistent. This frustrated them. The diagnosis that had spared her execution required maintenance. Insanity, once declared, had to be demonstrated repeatedly. Jane did not oblige in the ways they expected. She did not rage. She did not collapse. She did not confess anew with theatrical remorse. She sat, she listened, she responded with precision. Eventually, the doctors adjusted their expectations. They began to describe her as quiet, well-behaved, cooperative. These words appeared in her file with increasing frequency. She was no longer of immediate interest. Her value as a spectacle diminished once she failed to perform madness. Life in the asylum settled into something like stasis. Days blurred. Seasons passed, marked more by changes in light than by events. Jane observed other patients with the same attentiveness she had once brought to wards and sick rooms. She noticed patterns of behaviour, hierarchies among inmates, the rhythms of staff movement. The asylum, she realized, was simply another institution. It differed from hospitals in its purpose, but not in its structure. Authority still rested with those who controlled access, to food, to movement, to attention. Compliance was rewarded. Disruption was corrected. Jane did not disrupt. She was allowed small privileges over time. Books, writing materials, occasional work within the institution. She performed these tasks efficiently, without complaint. Nurses trusted her. Doctors relied on her calm presence in difficult situations. The irony did not escape her. She had been removed from society because she could not be trusted with vulnerable people. Now she was surrounded entirely by them. But this time, her authority was constrained. She could not administer medication. She could not make decisions about care. She was watched, not constantly, but enough to prevent autonomy. Control had been redistributed. Jane felt this loss acutely, though she did not express it. It was not freedom she missed. It was agency. In the asylum, endings did not arrive cleanly. Patients lingered for decades. Suffering was prolonged rather than resolved. There was no decisive intervention, only management. Jane observed this with growing detachment. She did not attempt to harm anyone, not because she felt reformed, but because the conditions no longer allowed for it. She understood boundaries. She respected them when they were enforced. Her internal logic did not change. She still believed that certain lives were prolonged unnecessarily. She still believed that suffering could be ended more mercifully. But belief without action remained belief. The doctors continued to write about her. They debated her case in journals and lectures, using her as an example of female criminal insanity. They speculated about her sexuality, her emotional development, her moral sense. They rarely quoted her directly. When they did, they selected fragments that supported their theories. Jane read some of these accounts later, when they reached the asylum library. She recognized herself only faintly. They had turned her into an object lesson, a warning, a curiosity, a justification for new diagnostic categories. What they had not done was ask whether their own assumptions had played a role in what she became. As years passed, public interest waned. New crimes emerged. New scandals replaced her. The newspapers stopped printing her name. The world outside moved on, comforted by the belief that the danger had been contained. Jane aged quietly. Her hair grayed. Her posture softened. Her routines remained unchanged. She lived longer than many of the doctors who had examined her, longer than the journalists who had written about her, longer than most of the patients she had once cared for. In this longevity, there was a final, subtle cruelty. She had believed in decisive endings. She had believed in resolution. The asylum offered neither. It offered continuation without purpose, time without direction. Jane endured it with the same composure she had brought to every other phase of her life. She did not seek redemption. She did not seek forgiveness. These concepts required an external moral authority she had never fully accepted. What she experienced instead was a slow erosion of relevance. She became part of the background, another quiet woman walking the grounds, another file in the cabinet, another patient whose presence required no explanation. In the end, this may have been the system's most effective response. It did not punish her spectacularly. It did not redeem her meaningfully. It simply outlasted her. And in doing so, it ensured that the most unsettling questions her life raised would fade along with her name, unanswered, unexamined, safely forgotten behind institutional walls. Chapter 16. What Remained Unsaid. Taunton State Hospital, years passing. Time in the asylum did not behave the way it did outside. There were no milestones worth anticipating. No seasons marked by celebration. No futures discussed with expectation. Time here was not something that moved forward so much as something that accumulated, layer upon indistinguishable layer, until days became texture rather than sequence. Jane adapted to this erosion with the same discipline she had adapted to everything else. She woke when she was told. She ate what was given. She walked the grounds when permitted. She read when books were available. She spoke when addressed. She learned the rhythms of the institution quickly, because institutions always revealed themselves to those who paid attention. The asylum ran on categorization. Patients were grouped by diagnosis, by behavior, by perceived risk. Some were loud, some violent, some lost entirely to inner worlds that could not be reached. Jane belonged to none of these categories comfortably. She was lucid, cooperative, quiet. This unsettled the staff more than overt disturbance would have. Madness, as they understood it, was meant to be visible. Jane's was not. Doctors continued to interview her periodically, though with diminishing urgency. The questions became repetitive, their curiosity dulled by her consistency. They wanted progress, deterioration, something measurable. Jane offered neither. She spoke the same way she always had, clearly, calmly, without embellishment. When asked if she regretted her actions, she paused, not out of hesitation, but consideration. She said she regretted being misunderstood. This answer appeared in her file with no further comment. When asked if she now recognized her actions as wrong, she said she recognized that they were unacceptable. Unacceptable was not the same as wrong, but the distinction was rarely explored. When asked if she felt remorse, she asked what remorse would change. The doctors did not press her further. What went unsaid during these interviews mattered more than what was recorded. No one asked her to describe the systems she had worked within in detail. No one asked about medication protocols, oversight failures, or the assumptions that governed care for the poor. These topics were uncomfortable. They suggested responsibility that extended beyond the individual. It was easier to locate danger within Jane than to examine the environment that had enabled her. She became, over time, a reference rather than a person. Her name appeared in lectures, articles, and discussions as shorthand for a type of criminal woman, the nurse who killed, the caregiver turned predator. She was invoked to justify reforms, to support theories, to warn trainees. But the substance of her life was reduced to summary. Jane was aware of this only in fragments. Occasionally, a new doctor would arrive, eager to speak with her. They would approach her with the enthusiasm of someone encountering a case they had read about but never seen. Their questions were more probing, more ambitious. They wanted insight. They wanted revelation. Jane disappointed them. She did not provide the dramatic interiority they sought. She did not frame her actions as loss of control or irresistible urge. She spoke of observation, decision, and outcome. She spoke of responsibility in practical terms rather than moral ones. This frustrated them. Some responded by doubling down on pathology, interpreting her restraint as repression, her clarity as denial. Others lost interest entirely. Jane watched these reactions with the same detached curiosity she had once applied to dying patients. She understood disappointment. Among the other patients, Jane was regarded with a mixture of indifference and quiet respect. She did not intrude. She did not provoke. She offered assistance when permitted, guidance when asked. Some patients sought her out instinctively, drawn to her composure. Staff noticed this and monitored her closely. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. Jane understood the irony fully. She had once been trusted completely. Now she was trusted not at all. In between lay the explanation the world had chosen for her. As years passed, she began to outlive the narrative constructed around her. Journalists stopped writing. Doctors stopped publishing. New cases replaced hers in textbooks. Her file grew thicker with routine notes and thinner with interpretation. She aged. The physical changes were unremarkable. Slower movements. Stiffer joints. Graying hair. What changed more noticeably was her relevance. She became another elderly woman in an institution filled with them, her history known only to those who bothered to look. Jane did not cling to memory. She had never been nostalgic. She did not revisit her childhood in reverie. She did not dwell on specific patients. Their faces blurred over time, replaced by the abstraction of pattern. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between routines, she thought about what had never been said aloud. She thought about the wards where death had been expected rather than questioned. About the medication cabinets left unlocked. About the language that disguised decision as care. About how easily suffering disappeared when it belonged to the poor. She thought about how many people had thanked her. Not out of irony. Out of recognition. Those moments had been real. The relief families felt had not been imagined. The gratitude patients expressed had not been coerced. Jane did not reinterpret these memories as evidence of innocence, but she did not discard them either. They complicated the story the world had chosen to tell about her. In the asylum, complexity was not welcome. It interfered with order. Jane learned to keep these thoughts private. Silence, she had always known, was a form of control, even when control was limited to the self. She watched the institution continue as it always had, absorbing people, managing them, outlasting them. She recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same pattern she had once worked within, only slower and more explicit. The asylum did not seek resolution. It sought endurance. Jane endured. What remained unsaid, what would never be written into her file, was not simply her reasoning, but the question her life posed to anyone willing to look beyond her. If a woman could learn over decades to kill quietly within systems designed to reward calm, obedience, and discretion, then what else went unnoticed, unexamined, unspoken? The asylum did not ask this question. History, Jane suspected, would not either. And so she lived out her years in the space between explanation and forgetting, contained not just by walls and routines, but by the silence that settled once the spectacle ended. That silence was the final institution. And it held. Chapter 17. The victims the records could not hold. Massachusetts, years remembered and erased. The names that survived did so by accident. They were preserved not because they mattered more in any moral sense, but because their deaths created inconvenience. They clustered. They left residue. They touched families with enough standing to demand explanation. These names, McNear, Jones, Dunham, remained attached to Jane like anchors, preventing her from drifting entirely into abstraction. But they were not the majority. Most of the people Jane had cared for, and killed, left behind no durable trace. Their lives had already been narrowed by poverty, illness, and social insignificance. Their deaths passed through the system as expected outcomes, processed efficiently and forgotten quickly. If they were recorded at all, it was as brief notations: age, condition, date, cause. The record did not preserve who they had been. There were elderly men whose hands had once been steady enough to work looms or lift cargo, reduced in their final years to tremors and breathlessness. There were women whose bodies had borne children, labor, malnutrition, and time, arriving in sick rooms already depleted. There were boarders, lodgers, laborers, people whose lives had not been organized around legacy. Jane remembered them not as individuals, but as trajectories. She recalled how suffering reshaped posture, how long-term pain altered speech patterns, how resignation settled differently in different bodies. She remembered who fought the end and who welcomed it. She remembered the quiet relief that sometimes followed the final breath, not just in herself, but in the room. These details did not enter the official story. In the asylum, Jane was occasionally asked whether she remembered the people she had killed. The question assumed a certain kind of memory: faces, names, moments of drama. Jane did not have those memories in the way the doctors imagined. She remembered process. She remembered the way the system had taught her who would be missed and who would not. She remembered how often families were absent, either physically or emotionally. She remembered the empty rooms left behind, quickly repurposed. What troubled her most, in retrospect, was not the absence of grief, but the efficiency of replacement. Beds were filled. Houses were sold. Wards moved on. This was not cruelty on anyone's part. It was momentum. Jane had learned early in life that momentum was indifferent to individuals. People disappeared and the world did not pause. Nursing had merely provided a context in which she could influence the timing of that disappearance. The victims who survived in the public imagination did so because their deaths disrupted momentum. The Dunhams disrupted inheritance. Annette Jones disrupted domestic boundaries. The McNear sisters disrupted probability. The rest did not disrupt anything at all. Jane understood that this selectivity would shape how history remembered her. She would be remembered not for the volume of harm, but for the harm that left evidence. The system preferred stories with documentation. In truth, the majority of her victims existed only as absences. Empty chairs. Discarded clothing. Lives closed without inquiry. Jane did not romanticize this invisibility. She did not claim it as justification. She recognized it as condition. The asylum staff rarely spoke of the victims. Their focus remained on Jane, her diagnosis, her behavior, her compliance. The dead had served their purpose in bringing her here. They were no longer relevant. This bothered her more than she expected. Not because she felt remorse in the conventional sense, but because the narrative was incomplete. The story being told about her was not simply simplified, it was distorted. It centered her as anomaly rather than symptom. It framed her actions as aberration rather than outcome. The victims became props in this narrative, names invoked to establish horror, then set aside. Jane sometimes imagined what a different accounting might look like. Not one that excused her, but one that expanded outward instead of narrowing inward. One that asked who these people had been before they became cases. What structures had shaped their vulnerability long before she entered their lives. How many others had died in similar circumstances without anyone ever noticing. She knew such an accounting would never be written. It would require attention to the ordinary, the poor, the unremarkable. It would require acknowledging that suffering did not begin with her intervention, and that death was often anticipated long before she arrived. These truths complicated the moral clarity people preferred. So the story remained focused on her mind, her pathology, her deviation. In the asylum, Jane watched new patients arrive with their own stories of neglect, abandonment, and institutional failure. She saw familiar patterns repeat, not of violence, but of erasure. People entered the system when they could no longer be managed elsewhere. They stayed because there was nowhere else to go. She recognized herself in them only partially. They had not chosen their confinement. She had. This distinction mattered to her. Jane did not seek to absolve herself by invoking her victim's vulnerability. She did not claim inevitability. She understood that she had acted, deliberately, repeatedly, and that those actions had ended lives. What she rejected was the idea that those lives mattered only insofar as they reflected on her. They had mattered before. They had mattered when they were ill and in pain and dependent on systems that measured value poorly. They had mattered even when no one wrote their names down. The asylum did not preserve this perspective. It had no use for it. Jane kept it to herself. In the long quiet of institutional life, where days were indistinguishable and endings delayed indefinitely, this private accounting became her final act of agency. She could not restore the dead. She could not correct the narrative. But she could refuse to forget that the story extended beyond her. History would remember her as a nurse who killed. It would not remember the people who died because they were expected to. Jane understood, with a clarity that never left her, that this imbalance was not accidental. It was the same imbalance that had shaped her life from the beginning, the quiet sorting of who mattered enough to be seen. She had learned to operate within that sorting. And in the end, she remained inside it, just another name that would one day require explanation, or be erased entirely. The difference was that she knew exactly how that erasure worked. Chapter 18. What she thought she was doing. There is a temptation, when a life has ended badly, to treat intention as irrelevant. History often prefers outcome to reasoning. Bodies over thoughts. Numbers over processes. Jane Toppan's story has usually been told this way: a nurse, a list of dead, a diagnosis that closed the case. What she thought she was doing is treated as either unknowable or unimportant, a detail swallowed by the larger horror. But intention matters, not because it excuses, but because it explains. Jane did not experience her actions as chaos. She experienced them as order. From childhood, the world had taught her that absence was the default condition. People vanished. Care was conditional. Systems did not protect, they managed. Nursing did not introduce her to death, it formalized what she already knew about it. It gave death rules, tools, and language. Within that framework, Jane developed a reasoning that was internally consistent, if ethically catastrophic. She believed that suffering was not inherently meaningful. Pain did not purify. Prolonged decline did not redeem life. These were not philosophical positions she arrived at through reading or debate. They were conclusions drawn from observation, from watching bodies fail slowly while families clung to hope that medicine could not justify. Jane did not see herself as opposed to medicine. She saw herself as completing it. Doctors diagnosed. Nurses managed. When management became prolongation without purpose, Jane believed someone had to decide what medicine refused to. She believed that someone should be the person who stayed. This belief did not emerge suddenly. It accreted over years of institutional reinforcement. She was rewarded for calm, for obedience, for discretion. She was trusted because she did not draw attention to herself. She was praised because things ran smoothly when she was present. The system taught her that smoothness mattered more than truth. Jane internalized this lesson deeply. When she administered lethal doses, she did not imagine herself committing murder in the dramatic sense. She imagined herself resolving situations that had already been decided biologically but delayed socially. She believed she was acting on behalf of inevitability. This did not make her passive. On the contrary, it made her precise. She chose patients carefully. She selected contexts that would absorb death without resistance. She calibrated dosages to mimic decline rather than rupture. She staggered interventions to maintain plausibility. These were not the actions of someone overtaken by impulse. They were the actions of someone exercising judgment. Jane's critics have often seized on her reported statements about pleasure, particularly her claim that she experienced something akin to satisfaction when patients died. These statements have been used to sexualize her motives, to reduce her reasoning to perversion. This interpretation is convenient. It allows the world to locate her violence in deviance rather than decision. It transforms her into an aberration instead of a product. It avoids confronting the unsettling possibility that she acted not because she lost control, but because she believed she had it. What Jane described more consistently than pleasure was relief. Relief that suffering had ended. Relief that uncertainty had resolved. Relief that something indefinite had become definite. For someone whose early life had been defined by waiting for a father who did not return, waiting for care that did not arrive, decisiveness held emotional weight. Ending things, rather than enduring them, felt like mastery. This does not absolve her. It clarifies her. Jane's moral reasoning was profoundly flawed, but it was not absent. She did not deny that she killed. She did not deny that she chose to do so. What she rejected was the idea that her choices were meaningless or accidental. She believed that the system had taught her how to act and then disowned her when she acted too well. In the asylum, this belief did not soften with time. It hardened. She listened as doctors explained her actions in terms of pathology, reducing her to drives and impulses she did not recognize in herself. She watched as her competence was rebranded as sickness, her restraint as repression. She saw how her explanations were translated into symptoms. She understood what was happening. Madness was not simply a diagnosis. It was a solution. It allowed society to condemn her without interrogating itself. It allowed nursing to remain morally intact. It allowed institutions to avoid scrutiny. Jane did not fight this interpretation because she understood its function. Systems protect themselves first. Individuals are expendable. She had lived this truth long before she ever killed anyone. If Jane had been born into a different world, one with oversight, with accountability, with meaningful alternatives to prolonged suffering, she might never have acted as she did. This is not speculation meant to soften her guilt. It is recognition of context. Her reasoning was shaped by what was available to her. She believed that death could be kinder than endurance. She believed that deciding was better than waiting. She believed that care, when taken to its logical extreme, included ending. These beliefs were wrong. But they were not irrational. Jane Toppan did not kill because she did not understand the value of life. She killed because she believed she understood it too well, stripped of sentiment, reduced to function, observed until it revealed patterns she could manipulate. In the end, what she thought she was doing matters because it forces an uncomfortable question. If her actions were the product of reason rather than madness, reason cultivated by institutions that rewarded control and ignored consequence, then the danger she represented was not singular. It was structural. Jane died contained, labeled, and explained away. But the reasoning that shaped her did not die with her. It remained embedded in the systems that taught her how to decide who lived quietly, who died quietly, and who was never noticed at all. Conclusion. What the system chose to remember. By the time Jane Toppan died in 1938, she had already been gone for years. Not dead, gone. Her name no longer appeared in newspapers. Her case was no longer debated in lecture halls. The diagnoses used to explain her had fallen out of favor, replaced by newer theories that did not bother to revisit old subjects. She existed only as a file number in a cabinet, a line in an index, a story occasionally misremembered. This, ultimately, was how the system resolved the danger she represented. Not by understanding her fully. Not by reckoning with what enabled her. But by outlasting her. Jane's life invites an uncomfortable conclusion. She was neither inexplicable nor inevitable. She was formed, trained, trusted, and protected by institutions that rewarded silence, discretion, and obedience, and that assumed women who performed care could not also perform harm. Her crimes were extraordinary in outcome, but ordinary in context. She killed where death was expected. She acted where oversight was weak. She chose victims whose absence caused little disruption. She was noticed only when the pattern touched those whose lives were recorded more carefully. The world that produced Jane Toppan did not ask whether suffering should be prolonged. It asked whether prolongation was customary. It did not ask who held power at the bedside. It assumed the answer was benign. Jane exposed the cost of those assumptions. This book has resisted the urge to render her either monster or mystery. Monsters absolve systems. Mysteries distract from patterns. Jane was neither. She was a woman shaped by abandonment, rewarded for composure, trained in environments where decisiveness was prized and accountability was diffuse. That does not excuse her. It explains how she was possible. Her victims, many unnamed, most forgotten, mattered before they became evidence. They mattered when they were poor, ill, dependent, and unseen. The tragedy is not only that they died, but that their deaths required explanation only when someone like Jane forced attention onto them. In the end, Jane Toppan did not disappear because she was understood. She disappeared because the questions her life raised were too unsettling to keep asking. And that, more than her crimes alone, is what makes her story endure.